Welcome to Module 2 of the MELI Unit's Strategic Planning course. In this module, we will introduce you to key concepts of logic models, including the difference between theories of change and logic models, the pros and cons of each, and the components of logic models. Let's get started. What is a logic model? A logic model is a graphic depiction of the relationship between your program's activities and its intended effects, or outcomes. It essentially maps out the full logic, step by step, of how your program is meant to lead to results. Let's take a second to compare and contrast this with what we covered in our Theories of Change module. There are a lot of similarities between the two, and in fact, they both do similar things. They help you clearly show the logic underlying how and why your program is supposed to work. The difference being that while a theory of change summarizes the big picture, highlighting the why behind your program, a logic model is a more detailed depiction of all of the steps along the way. Theories of change and logic models both have their benefits. It isn't an either-or, and in an ideal world, we'd recommend having both. It can be helpful to have the broad summary of the big picture, especially when communicating about the program with a range of stakeholders, or perhaps even early on in the program design phase. And it can also be helpful to have the detailed logic model, listing out each step along the way for program planning and especially for developing your monitoring and evaluation plans. Let's take a look at what goes into a logic model. Here we have a table with 5 components: inputs, activities, outputs, outcomes, and impact, each one building on the other. Let's go through them one by one. First, inputs. These are the resources that go into the program to make the activities possible. What do you need to make the program happen? Things like money or other financial resources, program-specific resources like intellectual or creative materials, physical resources, or time, expertise, and staff labor. All of these are examples of program inputs. Next are our activities. This is often the easiest thing to put on paper, since it's the program actions that are taken to achieve the program outcomes. In short, what does the program do? Maybe it's workshops, trainings, networking events, or internships. The list goes on and can really run the gambit depending on what kind of program it is. Starting from here is where the terms can feel a little tricky, but we'll walk through them step by step and make them really clear. Outputs come about immediately from the activities. They are the products derived from the activities and are directly linked to the activities themselves. So for example, if you held a training, the output would be the participants that completed the training. Or if the program involved language instruction, it would be the hours of instruction completed. The key thing to remember here is that the outputs are tied very closely to the program's control. There isn't much of a leap in logic happening between the activities and the output, since it's what is directly and immediately produced from it. Moving on into outcomes, this is where we see the effects that result from the outputs. These are one step or more removed from the program implementation. So they are to some degree outside the control of the program itself. So if people were trained in a workshop, you might expect that they develop new skills or knowledge as a result. This would be an outcome. Or if you hosted a cultural event meant to increase awareness or change attitudes related to cultural understanding, that change in attitudes or increase in awareness might be your outcome. Outcomes can be short or medium term, so they can occur right after the program, like skills, or they might take a bit longer to come to fruition, like seeing how people use their newfound knowledge by perhaps changing behaviors or perceptions, or even new organizational partnerships being formed. In more complex logic models, you might have multiple sets of outcomes, listing those that are immediate and those that are a few steps later. But we'll stick with just the one set of outcomes for today. Lastly, impact. These are the much longer term, broader changes, usually at the level of social, civic, environmental, or political conditions that the program contributes to. For us in the department, these are often foreign policy goals, things that would be articulated in a functional bureau strategy or integrated country strategy. For example, there's some overlap between outcomes and impact, of course, since they both concern changes taking place as a result of the program, but the main distinction is scale and influence. While outcomes are usually things that it's reasonable for a program itself to achieve, with impact, it's usually the case that one program's implementation alone wouldn't be able to lead to the impact all on its own. But the collective effort of multiple programs, or one program implemented over multiple years, might. To bring these components to life and to make them a bit more concrete, let's look at an example. Being an ECA exchange program, the NISLY program contributes to the broader impact of mutual understanding, which is at the heart of all ECA programs. That mutual understanding stems from outcomes of increased language skills and increased cultural knowledge among its participants. To achieve those outcomes, the program needs a certain number of hours of language instruction and a certain number of cultural activities for its participants, which stem from its activities. And to implement those language courses and cultural events, the program needs staff, funding, and materials. Together, these 5 components show a clear path of how the program is intended to get from the inputs all the way through to the impact. We've covered the first 5 components of the logic model and talked through how it can represent a neat line connecting the inputs all the way to the impact. Of course, we know that the real world doesn't play out so neatly, and there's a lot we can't control. There are 2 more important components of the logic model that help us visualize and account for the messiness of reality. Those are the assumptions and external factors. There's some overlap between the two, but assumptions refer to the things we believe to be true that are necessary for your program logic model to go as planned. These assumptions have to do with the linkages between the different steps in your logic model. The external factors, on the other hand, are outside factors that influence your program, typically informed by the context or environment of the program. Let's go back to our example. As I mentioned, the assumptions have to do with the linkages between each step in the logic model. They're what has to happen to get you to the next step in the logic model. So in our example, an assumption getting you from input to activities to outputs might be that a good number of youth will even want to participate in learning national security languages. An assumption getting you from outputs to outcomes is that they will practice the language they learned to solidify their skills. And an assumption needed for getting to impact is that those language skills will play a role in bettering foreign policy. As for external factors, there are a lot of contextual factors that could influence program success, such as the political or economic situation in participants' home countries. And that's it for our module on logic models. Whenever you're ready, you can head back to the training overview and move on to Module 3 on objectives and indicators.